Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Andy Brohl, who is going to update us on what's new and available in Merkel cell carcinoma.
Okay, good. Last but not least, out of the non-melanoma skin cancers we'll be discussing today is Merkel cell carcinoma. So, a very different cancer type compared to the two that we discussed earlier. Merkel cell carcinoma, first of all, is a quite rare cancer. Approximately 3,000 to 4,000 cases in the United States every year, versus the hundreds of thousands of the basals and squamous cell cancers that were described earlier. And also, unlike the previous cancers, Merkel cell carcinoma tends to be one of the more aggressive malignancies that we deal with for out of the skin cancers, more similar to melanoma, and if not more aggressive than melanoma from stage to stage. And so you can see an anecdote here of what can happen in some cases with rapid dissemination of original primary tumor to have multiple metastatic sites. Similar to other skin cancers that we deal with, and similar to melanoma, we've realized now for about 10 years almost that checkpoint inhibitor immunotherapy is a highly effective form of treatment for advanced cases of this disease. Here are some of the original trials that ultimately led to FDA approval of the top two agents, pembrolizumab and avelumab, an anti-PD-1 and anti-PD-L1 agent for this disease. And you could see that for advanced/metastatic cases of Merkel cell carcinoma, the response rates for this drug class are somewhere in the ballpark of 50% or even higher for even a single agent. Also importantly, patients who respond well to checkpoint inhibitor therapy tend to have fairly durable responses, at least compared to our historical experience with chemotherapy, which can work for Merkel cell carcinoma, but tends to work very temporarily. And essentially, once we got these initial trial data back, anti-PD-1 based immunotherapy very rapidly replaced chemotherapy as the main option to treat advanced cases of Merkel cell carcinoma, particularly stage 4 patients. But of course, this therapy only helps about half of the patients with advanced disease in the first place. And even of those half, we are starting to appreciate that the durability of response may not be permanent in all cases. In fact, there's now multiple reports out showing that once you stop the checkpoint inhibitor therapy, that there's at least moderate risk of relapse of disease. In our series that we published last year, about a 50% risk of relapse of disease after you stop the therapy. And so clearly there's a need for advances in treatment for these advanced cases. One approach that has been tested somewhat is to use a combination approach or combination checkpoint inhibitor therapy for cases that either don't respond well or even as a first-line therapy for advanced cases of Merkel cell carcinoma. So far, there's been two relatively small studies, given the rarity of this disease. Both of these are independent phase 2 trials. In other words, not randomized to anything, but just putting all patients on the combination therapy that looked at using a combination therapy that's commonly used in many cancer types, including melanoma and others, anti-CTLA-4, ipilimumab, and anti-PD-1 nivolumab. With somewhat discrepant results between the two studies, with one study showing what appeared to be superiority in the expectations of effectiveness, and another study showing it relatively equivalent to what you would expect for just a single-agent anti-PD-1. And since this combination therapy has significantly higher toxicity than just using a single agent, it's a little bit unclear whether this should be utilized routinely or not. We do know, however, that this combination approach does at least have some activity in the refractory space. In other words, if patients fail the more standard single agent therapy. And so this is a commonly used salvage therapy in the second line. But still, with an unclear role in the first line therapy compared to single agent anti-PD-1, which again helps only about half of patients, and salvage that only helps a minority of patients in the second line. Clearly, this is not enough, and we need further advances. Similar to other cancers, a logical question is whether we should integrate these checkpoint inhibitor therapies earlier into the disease process. In other words, for earlier stage patients that typically would be treated by surgery or surgery plus radiation. In many diseases where checkpoint inhibitor therapy is effective in stage 4 patients, we've tested in what we call the adjuvant setting after surgery or the neoadjuvant setting before surgery and shown that this can be a risk reduction strategy. And so logically in Merkel, which carries a high risk for later metastatic disease, at least for some of the more intermediate stages 2 and 3, it would be logical to test this question. In the adjuvant setting, i.e. after surgery, there's been one reported study, randomized study that came out of Germany, and that showed a trend towards a benefit for using these anti-PD-1 therapy in the adjuvant setting. However, this study did not meet its initial endpoints, and furthermore, did not show any appreciable difference in whether patients actually survived or not, i.e. overall survival, even though it did appear to be trending towards risk reduction in recurrence of disease. This is a forest plot that's showing that in basically all of the subgroups that were tested in this particular study, there tended to be favoring using therapy versus not using therapy in terms of the risk of the cancer reoccurring after surgery. There are several other ongoing adjuvant trials that have been fully enrolled, but we do not yet have the results for. The first of which is called the ATOM study, which is adjuvant avelumab, one of the anti-PD-L1 agents that's used in the stage 4 setting. This is a study that we participated in, and again, it completed enrollment. However, we don't yet know the initial results. There's another adjuvant study that's conducted by one of our cooperative groups that is using adjuvant pembrolizumab, the other FDA-approved agent in stage 4 disease, a large trial with 500 patients enrolled. Again, the study has completed enrollment, but has not yet been reported as to the results. And so at present, adjuvant therapy for Merkel cell carcinoma is not considered standard of care, as it has not been proven to be beneficial over and above what would be considered the standard practice for earlier stage Merkel cancer, which is surgery and or radiation. Moving on a little bit to neoadjuvant therapy, i.e. giving immunotherapy before surgery, there's significant enthusiasm within the field to try to test checkpoint inhibitor therapy to be given before surgery. This was mentioned by Dr. Kushalani in his talk, to some degree in cutaneous squamous as well. But we now know in at least some immunotherapy responsive diseases like melanoma that it is clearly superior to give some of these therapies before surgery rather than after if it's going to be given in the perioperative setting. And there's a number of reasons for this, and some of this is still, undergoing research, but it's clearly based on randomized studies at this point that it is more likely to be beneficial for the patient to do it in that order. And so for Merkel, there's some enthusiasm to test that theory as well. There's been only one reported study to date of neoadjuvant therapy in Merkel cell carcinoma, which is being shown here. And what you can see from these waterfall plots is that the majority of patients that are treated with neoadjuvant therapy or therapy before surgery have a reduction in the size of their tumors, which is the bars going down, compared to their pre-treatment baseline. Also, what this single study has shown so far is that if patients respond well to the immunotherapy before surgery, their outcomes are far superior to patients who don't respond well to therapy. And so again, using the pathological assessment and the radiological assessment of how these patients respond to the checkpoint inhibitor therapy is a good way to help prognosticate and give patients a better idea of what might happen down the road, and potentially may also give an opportunity to alter your therapy later. And so in the perioperative setting, again, to summarize, we have several ongoing studies in the adjuvant therapy setting that we are still awaiting results from. This is not considered standard of care, but we do have 2 rather large studies that we hope to hear reports of hopefully later this year that may change the equation for this. And a neoadjuvant approach, while there's some enthusiasm for it, and it is in guidelines to consider in select cases, It does seem like a promising approach based on one study. However, it has not been made clear cut where which patients should receive this therapy and how effective it really is. So with these questions in mind, I'll move on to a little bit of a brief discussion of what I see are the major trials that are being done in Merkel cell carcinoma right now, nationally and internationally. First, starting with the perioperative setting. By my count, there are 5 ongoing or recently completed neoadjuvant studies in Merkel cell carcinoma. The top 2 listed here are studies that are being conducted at a single center at Moffitt Cancer Center, led by our group. The top study has actually been recently completed in enrollment, but it's not yet been reported, though we anticipate doing so at one of our upcoming meetings, ASCO this June. The third study mentioned is, again, a single center study being done at UPenn. Again, and all 3 of these studies are based on anti-PD-1 foundation of treatment. And then there are 2 international trials, one being done in Australia and one being done in Italy, using other variations of PD-1 based approach in the neoadjuvant setting. In the adjuvant setting, on the other hand, i.e. the post-surgery treatment, there are no currently enrolling studies in this disease, as again, everybody is awaiting the outcomes of 2 studies that have recently been completed enrollment before moving forward. For patients with more advanced disease that are either stage 4 or unresectable, of course, there's enthusiasm to try to improve upon outcomes from anti-PD-1 therapy alone or anti-PD-L1 therapy alone. And so a couple of different ways that you might go about this. One is you might take the existing treatment and add something else to it. And so there are a couple of studies that are looking to do just that. The top study listed IFX WHO 2.0 plus pembrolizumab is a study that is soon to be activated. We anticipate hopefully within a month or 2 at our center, and is anticipated to be a multi-site randomized trial that I'm helping to lead. The other is a single site trial at this point, which is using a radiopharmaceutical plus a standard anti-PD-1 being done at the University of Miami. To my knowledge, these are the only 2 frontline studies being conducted in Merkel cell carcinoma specifically currently. In the immunotherapy refractory space, of course, we also have interest in trying to help salvage and add additional options for patients who failed the standard therapies. And there are a couple of larger multi-site trials being conducted currently. I've listed a couple here that are the more prominent trials being conducted at multi-centers across the United States. Outside of the several that I've listed here, there are also options for earlier phase trials that include Merkel cell carcinoma as one of their arms, though may not be Merkel cell carcinoma specific in their population that they're testing things in. And so just as a brief summary of the trial landscape in Merkel cell carcinoma right now and the current needs. So again, to summarize, Merkel cell carcinoma is a relatively aggressive skin cancer with a high risk of metastases stage by stage. We know that checkpoint inhibitor immunotherapy, specifically anti-PD-1 or PD-L1 therapy, has been highly effective for a subset of patients, but at best is probably helping about half of our patients currently. The big open questions right now are, how do we integrate these therapies earlier on in the treatment, such as in the adjuvant or neoadjuvant setting? And then what do we do for more advanced cases that don't fall into this 50% that are helped with this agent class? By my count, and looking at this on clinicaltrials.gov earlier today, I believe there's roughly 10 active trials that are open and enrolling and specifically focused on Merkel cell carcinoma specifically, both nationally and internationally. As I may have highlighted, my belief is that there's a high enthusiasm for testing these therapies in the neoadjuvant setting, i.e. before surgery. And I think you can see that nationally and internationally as well, based on the number of trials that are currently available for these 2 settings that are currently enrolling 4 versus 0. In part, of course, this is because we're awaiting some of the adjuvant trial results, as I mentioned before. But also, I think that our experience or collective experience with immuno-oncology and cutaneous diseases is such that we are enthusiastic about trying these therapies before surgery And so we're hoping that more patients make their way to these academic centers like us to have these trial options available to them. And again, for more advanced cases, there are a handful of trials that are Merkel cell carcinoma specific that are currently enrolling, both nationally and internationally. I've highlighted a couple of them in my prior slide. But thank you very much. I'm going to pass it back to the moderators and be happy to stay around to help answer some questions.